You've had a chance to think about it a little bit on your own and type up some of your own responses. What do you guys recall? Let's just discuss this for a sec. What do you guys recall as being the main incentives for a farmer to conserve soil? What were the things that what were the economic forces that were pushing him not to abuse his own soil?
If he doesn't abuse the soil, and he leaves it in better quality, then his resale value will be higher.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's definitely one source of benefit to the farmer is the it's sort of the the future time at which he cashes out and sells his land. He'll be able to make um, a larger killing on that sale if he doesn't degrade his land over the 10 or 20 years that he was using it. That's exactly right. There's one other sort of indirect way that it also matters too.
Does it maximize their profits in the long run if they use it like conserve their soil better?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so so those are two distinct things. I just want to make clear that those are distinct. The factor that Emily had brought up is the sort of the resale value at the very end of the farmer's sort of working life, but over time as well, the farmer is going to want to make not just profits this year, but also next year and the year after that and the year after that. And so those profits, if we go back to this soil model, I had sort of three basic relationships. Emily had brought up this relationship here, where the land value is positively related to soil depth, and so conserving your soil will increase your land value, and that's a benefit to the farmer. And then the other way that comes into play is indirectly through you know using a little bit less, a little bit less intense use of your land, maybe not farming it as intensely, and increasing some of your erosion control measures like the grass buffer strips or other kinds of crop rotation or fallowing or minimum tillage. Those kinds of things will eventually, that will increase soil depth, which actually has an impact on annual profits. So even if it even if you could increase your profits today by farming more intensely, um, if you do that, if you do farm more intensely, you're indirectly sort of decreasing your soil depth and making profit harder for yourself in future years. So those are some of the natural, those are the two main channels through which soil conservation would happen sort of naturally through the farmer's own self-interest. Okay, so that's kind of the baseline. So think of that as like the baseline case. Now let's move on to the second part of that question that I had posed in class assignment 8. What are some things that could potentially muck up this situation where there are some natural incentives for the farmer to conserve, but what might prevent him from doing that, or stand in the way of him or her doing that?
If he wants to make more profit in the current year, so then he uses more capital and variable inputs, so then he can't use as much in the future.
Yeah. So that's yes, he has some. So I'm gonna make a list of some, I guess, some barriers to efficient. I'm gonna call it socially efficient soil use. I'm gonna sort of Hadley's comment. I'm gonna sort of summarize as sort of just being a general short-sightedness. So there are built-in incentives. We just talked about them. We have built-in incentives in this model for the farmer to conserve. And one barrier, it's kind of a simple human nature sort of thing. It's possible that the the attraction of present profit, the attraction of getting some loot today, being able to make a killing right now is so enticing that you try to do everything you can to make this year as profitable as you can, and you don't maybe give proper weight to what your future income is going to be as a result of maybe your techniques of mismanagement today. I think we can kind of summarize this as just being like a general kind of not not being like how do I say it, like not thinking enough about your own future self in a way. Because the farmer himself would stand to lose something from this. It's just that maybe he doesn't put enough weight on kind of what his future self is going to want. Any other ideas about what could be a barrier to socially efficient soil use?
Maybe the cost of erosion control is more costly than the benefits they get from doing the soil control.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's a very interesting point. It could be the case that the soil erosion prevention measures are extremely costly. In which case, maybe it doesn't actually pay off from at all for society, because the resources it requires to conserve soil are so high that you'd prefer to have more food. You'd prefer to have more production. That's a possibility. Let me just modify what you said just a tad, and I'm going to call this financial constraints, which is to say maybe there are substantial fixed costs associated with putting in place erosion control measures, which even if they paid off in the long run, so maybe these measures are very expensive right now and they could pay off, they could be very, very beneficial for society and for the farmer himself over time. But the cost of them right now is very steep. Maybe there's not an avenue, there's not a channel to borrow money and get some credit in order to make an investment now, which could potentially pay off in the future. So it's, in a sense, you're right. I think they could be costly, but we would also expect if they do pay off, if they actually do pay off, even if they're costly today, if they do pay off in the long run, we would still expect maybe some kind of borrowing to occur, where you make a costly investment now, but you expect that over time you sort of get your money back because of the enhanced productivity. And one thing that could stop that is if the farmer lacks access to credit. So this is what I mean by financial constraints, is that you don't have access to be able to borrow money to make an investment that otherwise would be very very fruitful and beneficial for you. So this is credit or borrowing access. So that's kind of the second main sort of pathway that I could see this breaking down, where even though there's some incentives to conserve, they're not strong enough to lead to a socially efficient outcome. I have a couple more. Are there any other ideas about what could prevent socially efficient soil use?
Like weather events, is that one, like natural disasters and like severe weather?
That's an interesting point. Though, yeah. So I mean, those are definitely negative things, and those hurt productivity. Those hurt the farmer's income. But that's not exactly a social dilemma, because those are sort of things that are outside of your control. If we want to think about economic problems, things like weather events, things like natural disasters are negative, but there's not really a way we're sort of at the mercy of the weather. In that case, we have to just kind of take the hand we're dealt, and we have an economic problem if we could have done better given the hand we were dealt. So the economic problem comes in. We're dealt a given hand. Maybe it's a bad hand, but we still are doing as best as we can. That's not then we're kind of solving the economic problem. But if we're dealt a certain hand, it could be bad or good, but whatever hand we're dealt, we're not getting as much out of it as we could have. That's where the economic problem comes in. So I think that one is a little bit more of a that's just kind of a physical event that occurs, and then you have to just accept that there's not really any kind of different management you can do to prevent sort of unexpected shocks like that. So yeah, I would say that's a little bit different than kind of a social barrier to efficient use. Any other ideas? I have a couple more. Yeah, Amanda, do you have something?
Yeah, I had two ideas. One idea would be, for a social problem, I guess lack of education for farmers to manage their soil and lack of information for the best sustainable practices. And then for the second idea, I guess since the prices of food are already so low, when there is fluctuations in the price, I feel like if the the price of food drops, farmers might want to produce more, but not knowing that they're going to oversaturate the market and drop the price even more. So just like lack of knowledge in general.
Right. Okay. So yeah, let me take those one at a time. So I think actually in a way this lack of information, that's an excellent point about lack of information. Maybe, yeah, lack of knowledge about the benefits. So it could be that maybe that you just don't have a kind of a responsible view of the future. But it's also possible that you lack. It's maybe it's not that you wouldn't want to save for the future or conserve for the future, but it's that maybe you just don't know exactly how to do that, or what you don't understand the processes well enough to understand sort of how your actions today are affecting the future. So I'll categorize that sort of within the short-sightedness, I think. And actually a separate issue though in terms of lack of information, which relates to your point here. So I'm going to say that this is going to be this is related to Emily's initial point about the incentives of the farmer to be able to sell his land after he retires. So if information about soil depth or soil quality is not effectively like transferred into land prices, so I'm going to say information about land not translating into land prices, where maybe it's hard to know exactly what the quality of the land is. So if you degrade your land, if you let your soil erode, there might be some extent to which you're able to like hide that and not have it be obvious, because it's underground. I mean, there's ways that you can do geological tests and agronomic tests to look at the quality of the soil. And if there's a land transaction, the buyer of that land has an interest in trying to acquire that information. But if for some reason there's not a way for that information about soil depth to translate into land prices, then you have a situation where this link here, this link which we had talked about here, this land value link, if that information about soil depth doesn't translate into land prices, then there's like a barrier to one of the incentives for the farmer to conserve his land is no longer being communicated to him. So if you know for a fact that information is tricky to come by, and that the future buyers of your land aren't necessarily going to know whether or not you've degraded the land, if that's hard to monitor and pick up on, then all of a sudden this land value incentive is no longer really that important to you, because you know that even if you degrade your land, even if you are using it intensely now to increase your profits, it's not really going to hurt you that much in the future, because that information about the degradation that's occurred is not so obvious and not so transparent and not being communicated into the land price itself. So that's what I see as kind of a separate. That's what I would see as sort of the third point about another source of a barrier to efficient soil use, if that land price information is not being communicated to land markets, and that buyers are not going to pay a premium. Buyers are not going to pay a premium for well managed soil. That's possible. If there's not good information and good techniques of monitoring. Amanda, you made a second point as well about low commodity prices, which could be a factor as well. That's an interesting one, because you have a case perhaps where even if prices are low today, you might be able to anticipate that eventually people in the future are also going to need to eat. People in the future are also going to have a need to have well kept soil, and that would imply that food in the future is a very valuable thing to have. And if you have land, you have sort of a piece of technology that's able to produce food in the future. And so that would sort of be a case where maybe you are reacting too strongly to present signals, and not maybe considering the fact that there's future possibilities of food becoming scarce as the population grows, or as farming becomes more intense and as land degrades. That one maybe is a little bit, that price point you made, Amanda, is a good one, and that might actually still be kind of part of this short-sightedness this short-sightedness point where even if prices are low today, logically you ought to sort of be thinking about eventually, people in the future are going to want to be eating food. And if you are somebody that keeps your soil in good shape, you're going to be in good position in the future to be able to capitalize on that. If food does become a little bit scarce, if land does become scarce, the good managers will then be able to produce more food and be able to sort of capture some of those future gains. So I kind of see that point as, again, sort of being a subset of this short-sightedness point. But those are great ideas. I have kind of one more basic source of inefficiency that's possible. I'll call this one. This one is a little bit different than it's similar to short-sightedness, but I think it's a little bit in a different class, in sort of a different economic class than just pure short-sightedness. But it's maybe the farmer discounts the future more steeply than society would like. And I'm putting society in quotes because it's a loose concept. It's not it's not any one person. It's sort of an idea about what the sort of the aggregate preferences are for an entire population of people. We talked about this kind of relates a little bit to the idea of a social rate of time preference, which we had, if we had a couple components. We had the pure rate of time preference, rho, and we also had the elasticity of the marginal utility of income, as well as the growth rate in consumption. This was the formula we had for the social rate of time preference, which sort of was this rho parameter was the pure rate of time preference. That's sort of the degree to which we're impatient, that we would just kind of prefer have a mild preference for people that are living now versus people that are not born yet. And then this second part was sort of taking account of the fact that provided that we have C, provided we have some positive C, which was the growth rate in the economy, future people would be richer than people today. And we tend to think that our additional benefits of having our additional welfare, our additional utility that we get from having more income sort of declines as we get richer, because we already have, we just keep getting richer. We just keep adding more and more stuff. And each additional dollar doesn't give us as much additional happiness as, some earlier dollars. So this social rate of time preference was kind of thinking about how we want to maybe compare present generations to future generations. And typically this is, these numbers here are on the order of, in typical benefit cost analysis, when you're sort of discounting benefits across generations, kind of 1%, maybe 3% are kind of where this social discount rate tends to fall. Because anytime you're discounting the future, you're sort of implicitly putting less ethical weight on future people. And it's questionable exactly how steeply you would want to discount the benefits to future people, given that they're kind of, we expect them to be similar to us. Whereas maybe the farmer, if you're running a business, you might be discounting at something closer to maybe 5 to 7%, because that's sort of the rate of return. That's sort of the rate of return that you can get on typical kinds of investments. That's kind of the rate of return on the stock market, the annual rate of return on the stock market that's been accruing over the last 100 years or so. On average, that's kind of the last 100 years of stock market history show that 5 to 7% return is pretty typical. And if you've put money in the stock market and you let it grow over the long run, you'll get about 5 to 7% back per year. And so maybe if the farmer is sort of using that kind of business perspective to discount his future profits and to make business decisions, the farmer might be using, a discount rate, in the range of 5 to 7%, whereas kind of the ways that economists and philosophers typically think of a right amount to discount the future is somewhere a little bit more in the range of this 1 to 3%. So if the farmer, and this doesn't have to do with short-sightedness, the farmer could have perfect information, perfect knowledge about the future. He could know very well about what the benefits of soil conservation are. It just could be that the discount rate that he's applying to his decisions is higher than than what kind of society as a whole might prefer. So that's sort of the last main source of inefficiency that I could see be possible in this model. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back in my notes here. So let me just talk first, kind of generally about land and food. So this is a really interesting graph, which just kind of shows how much land there is and what kind of uses it goes for. So in this top bar along the top, we have the total land area on the Earth's surface. So we think about the entire surface of the Earth. 29% of it or so is land. The other 71% is oceans. And then let's think about that 29%. Then we can break that down further into 71% of that 29% is habitable land. 19% is uninhabitable, and then 10% of it is under ice. A lot of this is Antarctica, but 71% of that 29% is habitable. Okay, and then we have that fraction of land. So that would come to about 70% of, I guess that would be about maybe 20% or so of the Earth's surface is habitable. And then we can sort of break that habitable portion of the Earth's surface down into about 50% of it right now is used for agriculture, which is a hefty proportion of the land. About 37% is forested at the moment, and then there's another 11% that's kind of shrub and prairie, and then we have these small slivers of the habitable land on the right, very tiny slivers. 1% is urban, so we have 1% of the Earth's habitable land where all the cities are located, and then this other sliver, this other 1% of the habitable land is freshwater. So that's lakes, streams, ponds, rivers, any sort of surface water that's not ocean is part of this 1%. So we have a very tiny sliver of the habitable land where most of the Earth's population lives, and most of the Earth's land surface is covered by either undeveloped forest, and then the other half is agricultural land. So we have that's roughly the split of current land use. And then of that 50% agricultural land, a huge amount of that, over 3/4 of it is used to raise livestock, and then the remaining portion is used to raise crops. And if you look at, so that's the fourth bar is what I just said. About 3/4 is land devoted to livestock. The remaining quarter is land devoted to crops. But then the two bars underneath that are kind of, those show, the first one is the amount of land that goes towards calorie consumption. So there's actually, even though 70% of the agricultural land goes toward livestock production, that livestock production only feeds into about 1/6 of total calorie consumption. So there's a huge sense in which the land is not being used necessarily to produce calories per se. It's used to produce sort of better tasting food or meat, or foods that people prefer to eat as they get richer. People just tend to eat more meat as they get richer. And so the 77% of the livestock land goes toward about 17 or 16% of total calorie consumption, and then about 33% of total protein consumption. That's what this last bar on this graph shows, that about 1/3 of agricultural land that's used for livestock is used to feed protein diets. So I'll set that up, and then I have some ideas about kind of what that means and what that implies about our ability to sustain our food production. But there's a couple other just facts I want to present. So this is a graph showing total arable land and permanent cropland over time. So that's been rising. So this graph starts in the 1960s and goes to about 2011. And one thing that's interesting here is we sort of get a peak. We get sort of a peak around 1990 where we sort of reach peak farmland. We get to a point where we're no longer expanding. We're no longer expanding onto marginal land. We're no longer expanding onto forest land in order to produce more food. We're actually we've sort of reached a limit on how much we continue to infringe upon nature in order to produce food. We sort of reached a limit, and we're sort of even coming down a little bit in terms of how much arable land that we're using. It's been I guess it's going up and down a little bit over the last 30 years or 20 years, but it's pretty much reached a plateau, and we're not continuing to infringe upon undeveloped land this at the same rate as we were before. We've sort of reached a cap on that. And then as we've been doing that, keep in mind this graph here of food production per capita. Keep in mind that this food production since the 1960s, food production per person has been going up. It's been growing pretty steadily since the 1960s. It's continuing to grow. The amount of food per person that we're able to produce is increasing. So keep in mind also that since 1960, we've added an additional 3 billion people or so to the world's population. That represented something like a doubling or more than a doubling, between 1960 and 2011. And even with that doubling, there's been an increase in the availability of food per person, at least on average. It's not distributed evenly across everybody, but overall there is a growth in our capacity to produce food, and per capita food consumption is not declining even as population is growing. It's actually increasing, which is an encouraging. That's a very encouraging trend as we're thinking about just the well-being of people over time. Okay, so this slide actually is commenting on sort of the next two slides. So let me just present these two graphs as well. This is arable land per person, which is falling. So we're using less land. We have less available land, or we're farming less land per person, basically on every continent. This is broken down by continent. Every continent has a declining time trend of arable land per person, so that's going down. But at the same time, the arable land that's required in order to produce a fixed amount of food crop is also going down. Okay, so we have less land that's being actively cultivated. Some of it's being degraded beyond the point of use, and so that's going out of cultivation. Some land is going out of cultivation just because of natural economic factors, like prices aren't high enough to dictate that land should be in production. Sometimes if the price falls, marginal land sort of will fall out of production because it's no longer profitable to farm. So that's declining. But you also have this trend here on this graph where the amount of land required to produce a given unit of food is falling dramatically. And it's since 1961, between 1961 and 2012, we only need about 30%. So 30% of the land in 2012 is able to produce the same amount of food that 100% of the land produced in 1961. So we have these competing trends. We have arable land per capita falling, but we also have the efficiency at which we're using that land is increasing, and it's sort of a the future is going to be a little bit of a battle over which one of those forces is going to win out. Is the efficiency at which we can use land going to continue outpacing the rate at which arable land per capita is falling, or is population going to grow such that arable land per capita falls faster, and perhaps food production per capita falls? So this is sort of an ongoing debate. This is sort of the modern version of the Malthusian idea that Thomas Malthus put forth in 1798 about worrying about food production. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I've just presented just a couple of interesting trends here, which is that arable land per capita is falling as population grows, but at the same time, the efficiency of that land and the amount of land needed to be used to produce a certain amount of food is also growing at the same time. So let me just bring up one more point here before we finish today, and I think this has some implications for maybe some of the margins at which we might have to adjust our consumption or our lifestyle as we go into the future, and as we perhaps worry about growing populations and food shortages. Keep in mind that as people get richer, they're going to spend more on food, and at low levels of income, this means that they're going to spend more money on increasing their calorie consumption. but at a certain point, you start to spend less on less of your income goes to pure calories, and more of it goes to higher quality food. And typically, that means that meat consumption goes up. So that's what's been happening in in America, in Europe, in a lot of even emerging economies. As they get richer, they've been consuming more and more meat. And this will be a little bit of what I talk about in next class. But meat consumption actually has a lot of resource use that's required. A lot of water, a lot of land is used in meat consumption. And one of the things that I'll suggest as a possible future adjustment is that perhaps if it's the case that land and arable land and food in general does get scarce in the future, one of the ways we might see substitution is away from very resource intensive meats and more towards just more of a plant-based diet or more of a grain-based diet, which is a lot more efficient in terms of energy and water and land in order that's required to produce a certain amount of calories.